For most of our lives, we're told a simple story about humanity, that we are unique, recent, and destined. But when you zoom out, far out, beyond history books, beyond written records, and into the vast canvas of deep time, that narrative begins to blur. Because the true story of us, Homo sapiens, doesn't begin with pyramids or cave paintings. It begins hundreds of thousands of years earlier, in a world unrecognizable to modern eyes, yet shaped by the same species that fills today's cities and builds tomorrow's technologies. Anatomically modern humans, biologically indistinguishable from ourselves, have walked the earth for at least 200,000 years, perhaps over 300,000, based on recent discoveries. That's a span of time so enormous, so vast in scope, that all of recorded history fits into it, like a grain of sand on a beach. Now imagine this. If you took one of these ancient humans, dressed them in modern clothing, gave them a haircut, and placed them in a crowd at a train station, they wouldn't stand out. They wouldn't appear primitive or alien. They were us. They had the same hands to carve, the same brains to think, the same eyes to wonder. And yet, for the vast majority of that time, something strange lingers in the archaeological record. For over 150,000 years, our ancestors seem almost silent. We find tools, yes. We find evidence of hunting, fire, migration. But what's missing, almost hauntingly so, is what we call symbolic behavior. Art, ornamentation, music, complex burial practices, storytelling. For well over 100 millennia, these signs are largely absent, or so sparse that they vanish in the noise of time. Archaeologists sometimes call this gap a prehistoric time hole, a period in which fully modern humans existed but left behind almost none of the cultural signatures we associate with being truly human. Then, around 50,000 years ago, everything changes. Suddenly, there's a surge of creativity, a burst of expression, a tidal wave of symbolic behavior that appears to wash over the globe. Cave walls are painted with animals that seem to leap off the stone. Beads and pendants are strung and worn. Bodies are buried with care, and sometimes with grave goods that imply belief in an afterlife. People begin to navigate open oceans, reaching distant islands. And for the first time, the human imagination leaves clear, lasting marks on the world. This dramatic shift has fascinated scientists for decades. Why did we wait so long to become us? If the human brain was ready, why didn't symbolic culture ignite earlier? What sparked the fire that turned silent survival into art, myth, and meaning? At first, the answer seemed simple, almost too simple. For years, the dominant theory was that a single, sudden genetic mutation, perhaps in a key gene like FOXP2, rewired the brain, unlocking language, abstract thought, and the capacity for culture, a kind of genius gene flicked on like a switch. But that theory, elegant as it was, began to crumble. But as genetic research advanced, cracks formed in the foundation of that narrative. When scientists sequenced the genomes of our closest extinct relatives, Neanderthals and Denisovans, they discovered something unexpected. These ancient humans, long considered cognitively inferior, shared the same FOXP2 gene variants as modern Homo sapiens. In other words, the so-called language gene wasn't unique to us. It had been around for hundreds of thousands of years, quietly passed along through branches of the human family tree. This revelation shattered the idea of a singular genetic breakthrough and suggested something more complex, more gradual, that the potential for language, symbolism, and culture was not exclusive to our species, and it didn't arrive in a flash. This forced a profound shift in thinking. If the capacity for symbolic thought wasn't new, then maybe the archaeological silence wasn't silence at all. Maybe we just hadn't been looking in the right places. Maybe the record wasn't blank. It was just faint, fragmented, buried in layers of earth we hadn't yet uncovered or didn't know how to read. And as exploration pushed deeper into the past, the clues began to surface. Evidence from across Africa began to tell a different story, one that upends the notion of a sudden human revolution. In South Africa's Blombos cave, archaeologists uncovered pieces of ochre engraved with geometric patterns, zigzags, crosshatches, dated to around 100,000 years ago. Alongside them were beads made from shells, deliberately pierced and worn, unmistakable signs of personal adornment and symbolic thinking. These weren't tools of survival. They were artifacts of identity, of self-expression, perhaps even of belief. Nearby at Pinnacle Point, even earlier signs emerged. Fire-hardened stone tools, crafted using heat treatment techniques that suggest advanced planning, technical knowledge, and control over fire as a transformative force. And it doesn't stop there. At Olorgesailie in Kenya, evidence dating back over 300,000 years shows early humans transporting obsidian, a volcanic glass used for tool-making, across long distances, suggesting networks of exchange or cooperation. There, too, pigments appear, red ochres, likely used for body paint or symbolic purposes. These traces tell us that the human mind, capable of abstraction and symbolism, was already stirring, just not yet in the overwhelming abundance we later see in Europe and Asia. So why then does the signal grow so much louder around 50,000 years ago? If the cognitive capacities were already present, what changed? The answer may lie not in the brain, but in the group. It's not what we could think. It's how many of us were around to think together. For much of our early existence, human populations were tiny, scattered, and isolated. Small bands roamed vast landscapes, vulnerable not just to predators and disease, but to forgetfulness. A brilliant idea, a new tool, a novel pigment mixture, a melody hummed in the dark, could emerge in one group, only to vanish when that group dwindled, dispersed, or died. Innovations, no matter how groundbreaking, had little chance of surviving unless they could be passed on, preserved, and adapted by others. This fragile process, known as cultural drift, meant that even when creativity sparked, it could flicker out before igniting a lasting flame. But something shifted. Around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, human populations began to grow. Slowly at first, then more steadily. Clusters of people started living closer together, forging stronger social bonds, interacting across larger networks. This wasn't just a demographic change, it was a tipping point. With more connected minds, the odds of an idea surviving and spreading increased dramatically. A carved bead was no longer just a personal ornament, it was part of a shared visual language. A burial was not just a farewell, it was a ritual infused with meaning, repeated and passed down. These growing networks amplified culture. They allowed for high-fidelity transmission of knowledge, one person teaching another, with precision, correction, and emotional reinforcement. Children didn't just imitate, they were taught. Groups began to standardize tools, share myths, pass down stories. Culture became cumulative, innovations built on previous ones, and slowly, the invisible architecture of human society, cooperation, norms, symbols, took shape. What had once been scattered acts of expression became a wave of shared meaning, sweeping across continents. This is what archaeologists call behavioral modernity. And perhaps the most compelling evidence for its rise lies in the depths of caves and the pigments on stone. In the Chauvet Cave of southern France, around 36,000 years ago, artists painted lions stalking bison, rhinos clashing horns, and herds in motion, images alive with energy, shadow, and perspective. But remarkably, this wasn't an isolated burst of genius. On the opposite side of the world, in the Liang Tedonge cave on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, a painting of a wild pig, rendered with lifelike detail and ochre pigment, dates back at least 45,500 years. And in nearby caves, even older narrative scenes have surfaced, reaching as far back as 51,200 years. These images weren't created in a vacuum. They were the products of communities where ideas flowed, where symbols were shared, where memory extended beyond a single lifetime. What we see on those walls is not just the hand of an artist, it's the presence of a society that had developed the tools not just to survive, but to mean something. But it wasn't just art that bloomed. Technologies became more sophisticated, more specialized. People began crafting composite tools, multiple materials combined for greater function. Spear points were hafted onto wooden shafts using resin and sinew. Fishing tools emerged, along with bone needles for sewing clothing, indicating a growing understanding of materials and an ability to manipulate the environment with ever-increasing precision. There were even early musical instruments. Flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory have been discovered in Germany, dating back more than 40,000 years. These weren't just tools for survival. They were instruments for communication, identity, and perhaps even ritual. This widespread flourishing of symbolic behavior wasn't confined to a single region. It emerged in parallel across continents, across oceans, in groups who had never met but shared the same underlying capacities. It suggests that once the right conditions were in place, enough people, enough interaction, enough memory, the rest was almost inevitable. Human culture didn't explode because we suddenly became smart. It ignited because we became connected. And as we explore deeper into the archaeological record, it becomes clear that we weren't alone in this journey. For too long, human history has been portrayed as a solitary march to modernity, with Homo sapiens standing at the pinnacle, looking down on those who came before. But that image, clean, linear, triumphant, is a myth. In truth, the path of human evolution is a dense, braided river, flowing with many tributaries. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus, even more obscure hominin cousins, all were part of the same vast experiment of intelligence, adaptation, and survival. The Neanderthals, for instance, are no longer viewed as the clumsy caricatures of old textbooks. Instead, they are emerging as complex beings with rich cultural lives. In Bruniquel Cave in southern France, deep underground and long before Homo sapiens arrived in the region, Neanderthals broke stalagmites into sections and arranged them into rings, circular structures requiring coordination, lighting, and a shared purpose. These enigmatic constructions, dated to around 176,500 years ago, suggest not just intelligence, but intention. Even their art predates ours. At La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales caves in Spain, Neanderthals painted red hand stencils and geometric markings over 64,000 years ago, at least 20,000 years before the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe. At Krapina in Croatia, eagle talons were deliberately modified, likely worn as pendants. They buried their dead controlled fire with skill and adapted to brutal Ice Age environments with ingenuity and resilience. Then there were the Denisovans, an enigmatic cousin species known not from complete skeletons, but from a handful of fossil fragments and, remarkably, their DNA. First identified from a single finger bone and a molar in Siberia's Denisova cave, they've since emerged as a genetic ghost lingering in the blood of millions. Populations in Southeast Asia and Oceania, particularly in Melanesia and Australia, carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA, proof of ancient interbreeding between our species and theirs. And while we still know little about how they lived, the artifacts they left behind are tantalizing. Among the most remarkable is a bracelet found in the very cave that bears their name, crafted from green chlorite, drilled with a level of precision that suggests not just technical skill, but aesthetic awareness. Some estimate its age to be at least 40,000 years, possibly older. The level of craftsmanship implies that Denisovans too understood beauty, adornment, and perhaps status or identity, and their geographic range, stretching from the cold altitudes of the Tibetan Plateau, where a Denisovan jawbone was discovered, to lowland tropical environments, suggests a species as adaptable as it was mysterious. Even older ancestors challenge our assumptions. Homo erectus, who emerged nearly 2 million years ago, was long thought to be primitive, stoic survivors with limited intellect. But their longevity alone tells another story. This species endured for over 1.5 million years, far longer than modern humans have yet managed. They were the first hominins to harness fire regularly, and the first to leave Africa, spreading across Asia and into Indonesia. One astonishing artifact, a freshwater mussel shell found in Trinil, Java, bears a deliberate zigzag engraving, possibly 500,000 years old. This may be one of the earliest abstract designs ever made by a human ancestor. The lines are purposeful, not the result of random scratches or utility. They suggest a mind that could symbolize, that could mark time, identity, or meaning onto the world. And the surprises don't stop there. In the Rising Star Cave system of South Africa, researchers recently uncovered what may be the most paradigm-shifting find in paleoanthropology. Evidence that Homo naledi, a small-brained hominin with a cranial capacity barely a third of ours, may have deliberately buried its dead. Even more provocative are reports of possible abstract engravings etched onto cave walls near these burial chambers, dated to between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago. If confirmed, this would radically redefine the relationship between brain size and complex behavior. It would suggest that symbolic thought, once believed to be the exclusive domain of large-brained Homo sapiens, may in fact have deeper evolutionary roots. It would mean that long before we ever painted the walls of Lascaux or carved figurines from ivory, other humans, different but not lesser, were already exploring ideas of memory, ritual, and meaning. So perhaps that 150,000-year silence wasn't silence at all. It was the groundwork, the slow assembling of tools, symbols, and ideas, waiting for the right moment to catch fire. And when the spark came, it wasn't because we suddenly became smarter. It was because we became more connected. Our story isn't one of a sudden leap into modernity. It's a long, winding path, shared with others, built layer by layer across time. And the remnants of that journey still live in us today, in our art, our rituals, our need to create and to remember.